We will be talking about activism, about film series, how they end up in activism, in protest rallies. When did you, as a researcher, become interested in activism and protest rallies?
Well, I guess that happened towards the end of my PhD. I did my PhD in Calgary, Canada, and at the time, social media were kind of booming, and there were lots of crazy claims made about how these new technologies are going to change the field of democracy for us, how they are going to make politics better, and how every citizen will be able to participate. So I was a little bit interested in these crazy claims, and I wanted to see what is actually happening in practice.
Yeah,
so.
you were a little bit skeptical about it, maybe.
I am, like any true academic, I'm very skeptical of these grand claims. I try to keep my skepticism in check, but generally speaking, I wanted to see what happens on the ground. Is it any different from some of these, hype around social media, democratizing, making everything better for us?
Yeah,
so
and over the years, you dove into protest movements in Canada. You researched the Yellow Vest movement in France a little bit, but you also did extensive research in Romania, where you were from. We will dive into the Romanian case. Is there anything we need to know about the protests there in 2017, 2018 mainly, right?
Yeah, so maybe I can give you a bit of a background about this social movement that started in 2017 in Romania, when the government was trying to, hold your braces, decriminalize corruption. So there was a concerted effort on the part of the party in power to change the legislation so that if you receive a bribe for, say, less than 25,000 euros, that would be okay, and you wouldn't go to jail. You wouldn't be held criminally accountable for that. And against that background, a lot of citizens felt enraged. A lot of young people, young professionals across the country felt that this is kind of reaching the end line for them, and spontaneously started gathering out on the streets. Protests lasted for months and months. People kept on coming out, a little bit like the Yellow Vest in the sense that people
they became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right?
Well, yeah, let's say that. We actually had protests here in the Netherlands as well, with the Romanian diaspora organizing protests in Amsterdam and in The Hague and in Utrecht and Groningen. So a lot of the diasporic communities were involved in that as well.
Yeah, and then do you remember when it first struck you the use of obviously signs were always there, I think, written signs, but when did you start noticing sort of patterns in popular culture popping up in these protest rallies?
Well, one of the first things that I've noticed, living here in the Netherlands, I had access to some of these protests through social media, obviously, was that some of the photos that were circulated from these protests they were quite humorous in the sense that it almost seemed like a creativity contest where citizens would make up their own posters, and they would borrow symbols from different cultural frames in order to creatively make their point. And I thought that this is really interesting because in some cases you see the use of these cultural symbols and icons reappropriated in protest and social movements, and in others you cannot. So why is it that in some of these protests people feel the need to express themselves creatively on the issue that they are protesting on and bring those homemade posters that are very humorous and very funny yet very creative? So this is what drew my attention to the case.
And this is the question, what would be the answer?
Well, I don't really have a good answer for that, but
those damned scientists.
Yeah, I know, those damns. I do have a hypothesis, but it is not an answer. I think that to some extent, particularly in the post-communist country, the use of humor has been very subversive. So during communism, you were able to make certain jokes that were clever enough that the surveillance and the censorship system would not get. And perhaps some of that tradition has passed down through the generations. So maybe that's my hypothesis, but I don't know if it's an answer yet.
Yeah, we've already seen some examples you brought with you. What was the funniest, or what were the best for you as a researcher?
Well, I really like this one. Chuck Norris, please help. And the whole composition of this image, where you have a small child holding a poster referencing Chuck Norris, who in Romania has been extremely popular as a karate film actor who kicks the bad guys. I found it extremely funny. You really have to know who Chuck Norris is in order to make sense of this poster. And you really have to know a little bit about Chuck Norris as a fighter, as someone who is just a regular person but can kick ass really bad. So the fact that a child is holding this sign, the child himself or herself coming to this protest with their parents and having a sign about Chuck Norris, I think that this whole juxtaposition of signs and images is extremely interesting.
Yeah, one of the things that keep on popping up is this guy, right?
Yes.
Is it? Does it? Can you try it on, or is it? Sort of.
Are we gonna do this with the masks on?
No, we're not going to do the interview that way, but. This is, everybody knows this one, right? The one we have on is slightly yellower than those ones. Oh, is this the same? Yeah, it is, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So tell me about this one.
So this is Guy Fawkes, who actually has been made popular in the early 1600s in England, when a group of Catholic radicals was trying to bomb the parliament and kill the new king, as well as decapitate the state, so to speak. His image then becomes reappropriated. This was the face, apparently, of Guy Fawkes. His image becomes reappropriated through successive cultural texts as a symbol of protest, as a symbol of resistance, as a symbol of anarchy, of radicalism, of horizontal leadership or horizontal organization, and so on. What I find really interesting about the symbol is that throughout the centuries, it has been reappropriated in different ways. For instance, in the 1800s, a British writer wrote a book about him and re-brought him to the attention of the public opinion. Then in the 1980s, we had a comic book that re-brought this mask, V for Vendetta, as a symbol of anarchy. Then the film, of course, which you have probably seen, where the mask becomes a symbol of an idea, a symbol of a movement, of a resistance movement against a totalitarian state that cannot be easily crushed because nobody knows who's behind the mask, but it doesn't really matter. The mask is the idea and the mask is the mobilizer. Then Anonymous, all the way to Occupy.
Yeah.
So this
and
is
why
an
is it
example.
this one? Because the success of the Guy Fawkes mask is unprecedented, right? What's so good about this symbol?
I honestly don't know. Why this one and not another one? Maybe because it grants you a bit of anonymity and you don't know who's behind the mask. Maybe because the symbol itself has been reappropriated throughout centuries and invested with new meanings, political meanings. But remember that initially the guy himself was to be a terrorist, someone who wants to blow up parliament. So from a terrorist, he becomes a symbol of resistance against an oppressive state, against authoritarianism, against a political elite, in the case of Occupy, that doesn't listen. So perhaps the symbol itself has become so empty that it can be easily associated with new movements and new causes, yet still signal politics, right? As the first thing that comes to mind.
If this would be the number one in popular culture symbols ending up on the streets and protest rallies, what would be number two and number three for you as sort of popular symbols?
Well, one of the things that I was suggesting that we talk about today is the image of the handmaids. So should we go there?
Yeah, that's all right. Handmaid's Tale, for those of you who haven't seen the amazing series.
Yes, so you have an image right here, this image of women who dress in red. In the book by Margaret Atwood, this is supposed to be the modesty outfit, an outfit that women who are basically reproductive vessels to be hired by rich families in order to produce offsprings. This image of these these women dressed in red becomes a symbol of I don't want to say feminist resistance, but a symbol of women and the fight that they have to go through, the fight for recognition, the fight for human rights, for equal rights. And it becomes reclaimed, particularly in the context of the first 100 days of the Trump presidency. So the whole juxtaposition of the political context and some of the symbols provided by popular culture becomes really interesting here. Now, Margaret Atwood wrote her book, The Handmaid's Tale, in the context of, well, as far as I know, she drew inspiration from the Iranian Revolution. And she wrote this book in the context of a religious fundamentalist state that takes away the power of women to decide over their own bodies, over their own future, over themselves as human beings. Yet the TV series are released right in the context of Trump's early days of his presidency, and they become reappropriated for this new context. And the first marches in Washington, the women's marches in the wake of Trump's success, electoral success, reappropriate the symbol. So we see these women dressed in red across the United States in women's marches, but we also see them reappropriated in other contexts, in Australia, in Poland, as a symbol of women fighting for their rights to be able to choose over their own bodies, over their own future.
Yeah. Would you say this is a good thing or an interesting thing seen from the perspective of the protesters? Does it make protesting more effective, or does it make it easier to communicate what you're standing for, or?
Well, there is a certain layer of publicity that is associated, or visibility, if you want, that is associated with the use of the symbols, because these symbols are very photogenic, can I say that? They provide for very good photographs. They ensure that the media will cover these events. They are very theatrical, very spectacular, very dramatic, and the same can be said about this mask. So in one way, the use of the symbols really facilitates the communication of the message of the protesters. Remember that most of these images are perhaps taken by the media, but then recirculated by all of us on social media. So there is a sort of a transmedia aspect to the circulation of these messages. On the other hand, you really have to know what the symbols stand in order to understand what they are all about. They have to speak to you, and they speak to you if you are already immersed in that context, if you are already part of that cultural repertoire, part of those cultural references. So in a way, they also speak to those who are already part of your audience. Do they reach outside of your audience? Can they reach those who perhaps are not part of the protesting group? That remains to be seen.
So they're in a way also excluding people, or?
But that's the problem with any protest or any social movement. It represents the cause of those who fight for it, but it also creates a division in society between those who support it and those who don't.
Yeah. Last question. We're talking about series and films ending up in protest movements. Does it also happen the other way around?
I don't really have a good example in mind, and perhaps members of the audience can think of things that have originated in social movements or protests and then ended up being taken up in films or in popular culture in general.
Well, I would say that, sort of, for example, the protests in Hong Kong, the umbrella would make a fantastic symbol to be incorporated in a film or a series, right?
Yes, but I guess filmmaking, like academic research, takes some time to be developed and produced, and the umbrella is just too fresh. There are certainly films made, for instance, around the movement of the Indignados and the Occupy Wall Street, documentaries as well, but I have not seen them popularizing a specific symbol. This one appears, but I cannot think of any specific symbol that would originate in a protest and then become an icon in a film. But maybe you guys can help me later on.
We're going to help you later on at the bar. Thank you for being here. Delia Dumitrica.
Thank you.
Thanks.